Concept 25.3 is all about looking at this geologic time scale. And of course, if you looked at, say, just your own timeline of your life, you've got your basic days, Monday through Friday, where perhaps nothing exciting happens. But there are certain dates within the timeline that is your life that are more important than others. So for perhaps you might mark your 16th birthday as being a particularly important date, or perhaps the date you got your braces off, or the date, of course, your mom might say the date that you first learned to walk, or something to that effect, or perhaps your first day of kindergarten. Those would be more significant dates because something major happened. Well, the geologic time scale is very similar, where there are key events that we consider particularly important, and we use those key events to kind of separate the geologic time scale into certain sections or pieces. So it says key events in life's history include the origins of single-celled and multi-celled organisms and the colonization of land. If we look at the geologic record, we divide it first into very large segments called eons, and that would be the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic eon. And I'll show you a picture or illustration that will help clarify this. So right now we are in the Phanerozoic eon, and then beyond that, the Phanerozoic, it says, encompasses multicellular and eukaryotic life. So of the three eons that have occurred, it's only this most recent, last one, the third one, that has any sort of multicellular or eukaryotic life in it. And then in this eon that we're now in, the Phanerozoic, it's divided into three smaller segments called eras, and they are the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And we'll find out that this division is usually marked by major extinction events, and we'll talk about those. So the largest division is an eon, and that would be the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic, and we are in the Phanerozoic now. And then we could subdivide the Phanerozoic into the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, and the Cenozoic being the most recent one. So let's take a look at a picture, and that'll kind of help understand. So here we have ancient time, and the Earth forming about 4.6 billion years ago. And then we have the Archean and the Proterozoic, and then all the rest of this they're subdividing out so we can see it more. So for the first two of the three eons are down here, we don't have a lot as far as life on Earth. And then this last eon, this third one here, that would be the Phanerozoic eon. That is subdivided further into these three that we see. That would be the three eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And you can see then, you might see other words off to the side, and we'll talk about those, that perhaps look familiar, particularly like Triassic and Jurassic. These would be the times of the reptiles, the times of the dinosaurs that lived in the Mesozoic. And then we have the Cenozoic that we're in now, and the current subdivision that we're in is called the Holocene. The Holocene. Your textbook on page 515 also does a great job of kind of laying it all out to where you have the various time divisions lined up. So here we have the various eras of Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and then beyond that we have further subdivisions of period and then epoch. And it also talks about some of the important events in the history of life. So we can kind of zoom in on that just a little bit. So if we go back to the early eon, the Archean eon and the Proterozoic eon, you see that for a huge span of time there is not a lot going on as far as life on Earth. And then within the Proterozoic we have some of the first eukaryotic cells appearing and coming up, and then within the Paleozoic we start to see an increase in the diversity of life. And then that of course continues into these eras that we're currently in, the Cenozoic, and then we get to our epoch called the Holocene, which is where we would find Homo sapiens and the modern creatures that you see today. You're going to find, like I said, that oftentimes the major boundaries between geologic divisions, especially the eras that we're going to talk about, they correspond to extinction events in the fossil record, times when there were mass extinctions and huge numbers of species were wiped out. So paleontology is all about exploring this. There's a great video by a band called They Might Be Giants called I Am a Paleontologist. If you've never seen that, you can click on this and play I Am a Paleontologist. I've also uploaded it to the notes file, or look it up on YouTube. They have an entire album about science. Of course it's written for younger kids, but I still think it's cool. So here's the video, I Am a Paleontologist. Go look that up on YouTube or potentially in our notes online. Your textbook does a good job of stepping you through geologic time using this idea of a clock. And so we're going to use this idea of a clock as we move along here. We're going to start by looking at the divisions of the eons. The eon is the largest division, and then we go to the eras, the periods, and the epochs. And so here we have the origin of the solar system and Earth. That would be about 4.6, 4.7 billion years ago. And then we have a huge span of time to where there is no living creatures on Earth. And then at some point about 3.8 billion years ago, you have prokaryotes that are alive here on Earth. And again, for a huge span of time, there are only prokaryotic creatures. Then you have a rise in atmospheric oxygen that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Again, still a long period of time before you see any sort of eukaryotic creatures. That would be in the Proterozoic. And then a long span of time before you have any multicellular creatures. And finally, we don't even get to what we would consider the animals until we get well into some of our final eon, and then we can subdivide that into the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And we're currently in the Cenozoic era. And you'll notice humans are right there. We are just a sliver, a thumbnail on the entire time scale that we're going to talk about. So as we go through our notes, they're going to use this clock idea to kind of keep track of where we are throughout history. Let's start way long ago. So we're talking about at the very beginning, potentially 3.8, 3.7 billion years ago, with the very first prokaryotic cells that we would consider life, living creatures that we have direct evidence of. We do have fossil evidence of some of these early prokaryotes. The first single-celled organisms, the oldest known fossils that we have, are called stromatolites. And stromatolites are rocks formed by the accumulation of sedimentary materials in bacterial mats. So you would have these single-celled bacterial creatures, basically groups of single-celled creatures, and they would accumulate into what we call bacterial mats, and they would accumulate sediment that would form into these layers. And you can see some of these layers in some of the fossils that you see here. Stromatolites date back to about 3.5 billion years ago, and believe it or not, there are still examples of stromatolites that are alive on Earth today. So here in Australia, there's an area here in shallow warm seas, there are bacterial stromatolites that are still alive, and they're still going through the same process of putting together a sedimentary material that create these rocks, these fossils that then we can find. So you can see these layers of sediment created by these bacterial mats. Prokaryotes were the Earth's sole inhabitants, the only life on Earth, for about 3.5 billion to about 2.1 billion years ago. So for a huge span of time, life on Earth was only these simple prokaryotic creatures. So if we have direct evidence of these stromatolites from 3.5 billion years ago, and they were fairly complex communities of bacterial single-celled organisms, you have to imagine it's a reasonable hypothesis that single-celled organisms began before this time period. So you might hypothesize that single-celled organisms originated maybe 3.7 to 3.8 billion years ago. We don't have direct evidence of that, but we do have direct evidence of these fairly complex populations, so you would expect that they began prior to that time. Let's continue going forward to maybe about 3.5 billion years ago. We have a rise in atmospheric oxygen that we need to talk about, because that is an important change in the environment that leads to other changes in the living creatures on planet Earth. About 2.7 billion years ago, we had what we call basically an oxygen revolution. Ancient cyanobacteria, which would be ancient bacteria that's capable of doing photosynthesis, produced oxygen through the photosynthetic process. As a matter of fact, most atmospheric oxygen in the air is of the biological origin. It comes from the splitting of water that happens in photosynthesis. And so in this case, when we're talking about this ancient environment, that's where the majority of the oxygen would have come from this ancient cyanobacteria. The oxygen would have built up, first in the oceans. The vast majority of it would dissolve in the waters of the ocean. But eventually the water in the oceans would kind of reach a saturation point of oxygen, and that would be released into the air as well. So at first, the ocean waters would become saturated with O2, and that would cause a chemical reaction with the dissolved iron that would also be found in the waters of the ocean. And if you know from any of your study of chemistry, if you have a chemical combination, a chemical reaction between oxygen and iron, you're going to form rust. And then that rust would have precipitated, it would have fallen out of solution, and it would have slowly settled at the bottom of the ocean, on the ocean floor. We can actually see this in the rocks and fossil materials that we have today called banded iron formations. And so in various parts of the world, we have rocks that at one time were the ocean floor, and you see these banded iron formations, and this would have been precipitates of rust, basically iron oxide that formed as the percentage of oxygen increased in the ancient atmosphere. So about 2.7 billion years ago, the O2 basically saturated the oceans and began to accumulate in the atmosphere, and then you would start to have the rusting, the chemical process of these iron-rich terrestrial rocks. So you would kind of have the same process of rusting start to occur in the rocks that were on the land, because now there's a huge amount of oxygen within the atmosphere. We call this the oxygen revolution. So that was about 2.7 to 2.3 billion years ago, and this was a major change because many of the organisms that lived at that time were anaerobic. They did not live in an oxygen environment. They were oxygen free, and oxygen can have some negative effects chemical wise on certain creatures, and so this would have caused the extinction of many anaerobic prokaryotic groups. Now some of those groups of course would have survived, and there are still some of those groups around that live in anaerobic conditions. Like if you have a septic tank, in your septic tank there are anaerobic bacteria. They live in an oxygen free environment, and when exposed to oxygen they generally die off. So there are still some of those around. Others of those creatures would have evolved and changed over time and adapted to using oxygen through cellular respiration to harvest energy. That's what our cells do today. That's what living creatures that are aerobic, they use the oxygen as part of the process to release energy from their food source. So if we look back at Earth over billions of years, say from 4 billion years ago to the present day, we can see these changes in atmospheric O2 as compared to modern day. And so you can see this major jump that occurs right here. That's the oxygen revolution. You also see this second little jump that we'll talk about, and that's likely from the formation of land-based plants with chloroplasts also doing photosynthesis here. So you kind of have two jumps, but the major one is right here at this point. So again, that graph shows that the early rise in O2, and then it shows a later rise. That early rise was caused by ancient cyanobacteria. So these would be very simple creatures that had the ability to do photosynthesis. And then that later bump that you saw was likely because of the evolution of eukaryotic cells containing chloroplasts. And initially that would be water-based plants like algae, very simple creatures, eukaryotic, but they do contain chloroplasts. And then of course with the addition of land-based plants you would have more photosynthesis as well. So jumping ahead to about 2 billion years ago, we finally get to the point where we have eukaryotic cells. So all of this time, up to about 2 billion years ago, we've had only prokaryotic cells. Finally, eukaryotic cells begin to show up in the fossil record about 2.1 billion years ago. The oldest fossils of eukaryotic cells date back to that time, about 2.1 billion years ago. Eukaryotic cells, recall, are the cells of our body, the cells of most plants and animals that we see around us today. They have a nuclear envelope, they have the organelles like the mitochondria and the ER and the cytoskeleton, different from some of the bacteria that we've discussed. Remember that we talked about last semester the endosymbiont theory. The endosymbiont theory proposes that the mitochondria and the plastids, such as the chloroplasts, at one time were perhaps separate creatures all by themselves, and they were somehow ingested and began to live within a larger cell. So an endosymbiont is a cell that lives within a host cell, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence, a range of evidence that supports this idea that our mitochondria and the chloroplasts used to be their own separate cell, their own separate creature. So there is a lot of evidence for this endosymbiont theory, and although this process seems pretty unlikely, scientists have actually observed cases in which endosymbionts that began as prey or parasites began to have a mutually beneficial relationship with their host in as few as 5 years. So you can imagine this process perhaps over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and it is a possibility that it could come to be. the prokaryotic ancestors of what we now know as the mitochondria and the plastids like the chloroplast, they probably gained entry to the host cell as either undigested prey or some sort of internal parasite. And in the process of entering that cell, they slowly became interdependent, and they basically provided some sort of benefit to each other, and eventually they became basically a single working organism. There's also what's called a serial endosymbiosis, which is this idea that this has happened more than once, and it supposes that the mitochondria evolved before the plastids through a sequence of a couple of these endosymbiotic events. And the reason they say that is because all of the eukaryotic cells, plant and animal that we know of, have mitochondria, but only the plant cells have the chloroplasts. So perhaps this happened twice. Perhaps the first occurrence of this was with the mitochondria, and then in some of those it happened again where they took in another cell that became the organelle of the chloroplast, because all eukaryotic cells have the mitochondria, but not all contain the plastids such as the chloroplast. So here in your text is a diagram of how this potentially could have happened. Here we would have basically an ancestral prokaryotic creature, and you might have the development of certain plasma membranes like the endoplasmic reticulum and the development of an membrane surrounding the nucleus. And then at one point you might have the absorption of this other particular prokaryotic cell that would eventually become the mitochondria. So this would be an ancestral heterotrophic eukaryote. This would be like an ancestral animal cell. And then at some point further, this may have happened again, where here you have a photosynthetic prokaryote that was also brought into the cell, and that became, say, for example, the chloroplast that we know. So now we have an ancestral photosynthetic eukaryote. So this would be an ancestral plant cell, where this would be an ancestral animal cell. So what's the scientific evidence that kind of supports this endosymbiotic origin of mitochondria and plastids? Because it kind of sounds like a fairly out there idea that this would happen, but there actually is quite a bit of evidence that kind of supports the idea. Number one, the inner membranes are similar to the plasma membranes of the prokaryotes. So the inner membranes of the mitochondria and the plastids, they're actually very similar to the plasma membrane of a prokaryote. So that would make you think that perhaps it is an ingested prokaryote. The division of mitochondria and plastids is similar in these organelles and some prokaryotes. So the way that they divide or reproduce these particular parts, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, is very similar to the way that prokaryotes divide, or some prokaryotes divide. These organelles transcribe and translate their own DNA. Mitochondria and plastids like chloroplasts, they have separate DNA. They have their own DNA that is different and apart from the normal cell DNA in the nucleus. That is very interesting. That very much seems like that means that it was one time its own creature. And then finally, their ribosomes are more similar to prokaryotic than eukaryotic ribosomes. Not only do they have their own DNA, but they have their own ribosomes. And if you look and study those ribosomes, they are more like prokaryotic ribosomes than they are like the other eukaryotic ribosomes that you find in a eukaryotic cell. So all of this is really good evidence that perhaps these two parts of the cell, these mitochondria and the plastids like the chloroplasts, at one time were their own separate prokaryotic creatures, and they were ingested in a way, and instead of being destroyed, they developed a symbiotic relationship, a helpful relationship between the cell and that particular what at one time was its own cell, and that is perhaps how the eukaryotic cells came to be. Recall that all this time we've still been talking about single-celled life. So now we have prokaryotic creatures, we have some eukaryotic creatures, but we're still only talking about single-celled organisms. At this point, we finally began to develop multicellularity, and the evolution of eukaryotic cells allowed for a greater range of unicellular forms, so we could have a wider variety of single-celled creatures now that we have eukaryotes. But what about multiple cell creatures? What about, the vast majority of creatures we see around us today are made up of many cells? How did that develop, and when did that happen? Well, the second wave of diversification occurred when multicellularity evolved, and it gave rise to the very first multicellular creatures such as algae and plants and fungi and then eventually animals. And much like, say, an orchestra can play a larger variety of much more complex music than a single violinist can, multicellularity allowed for another wave of diversification with greater complexity. Now suddenly there was a wider variety of life, and you had this tremendous ability to change and be different now that there were multicellular eukaryotic creatures. So we began to see a relative explosion of varieties and differences of the types of life on Earth. So now we're up to about 1.5 billion years ago. So we have gone billions of years prior to multicellular eukaryotes that are finally starting to get us closer to the kind of life that we think of for the most part today. So about 1.5 billion years ago. Comparisons of these DNA sequences that scientists have done date the common ancestor of multicellular eukaryotes to about 1.5 billion years ago, and the oldest known fossils of multicellular eukaryotes are small algae that lived about 1.2 billion years ago. So one good question that you might ask is, for a long period of time only very small multicellular eukaryotes existed. Why, even after the development of multicellular eukaryotes, were they so small and such tiny little simple creatures? How come they didn't quickly develop into the more complex and larger creatures we see today? One possible explanation was, at the time when these multicellular eukaryotes developed, there's something called a snowball Earth hypothesis, that at the time the Earth was going through some major changes, some major climatic changes, including ice ages, and this hypothesis suggests that the period of extreme glaciation confined life to a pretty small area of the Earth, where the Earth was covered in large expanses of ice and frozen ground, and so perhaps life was confined to just a few areas around the equator where it was warmer and where liquid water was more prevalent, or maybe deep sea volcanic vents, and this lasted for quite some time, maybe from about 750 to 580 million years ago. So perhaps we didn't see an explosion of a wider variety of larger multicellular eukaryotes because of the constrictions of the environment at the time, including this snowball Earth hypothesis. Some of the first larger, more complex creatures that we have fossils for are Ediacaran, the Ediacaran biota. They were a variety of larger and more diverse soft body organisms that lived about 575 to 535 million years ago, and the sudden, I wouldn't call it sudden, but the showing up of these fossils about this time period, it happens about the same time when geologists tell us that the snowball Earth began to thaw. So it kind of makes sense, if you put those two together, that perhaps it was the weather conditions, the climatic conditions, that kept the evolution of these various animals in check to some degree. And once the Earth began to change and develop into a more temperate climate, suddenly you had the ability for these creatures to diversify and to change into beginning to be some of the more larger, more diverse creatures that we see today. Finally, pretty much last but not least, we're going to get to animals, and that would be about 500 million years ago. So animals finally began to appear, or the creatures that we would call animals, about 500 million years ago. And we're going to discuss what's called the Cambrian explosion. And you've probably heard of this before. The Cambrian explosion refers to the sudden appearance of fossils resembling modern animals and phyla in the Cambrian period, which was about 500 million years ago, 535 to 525 million years ago. And of course, I want to make sure that we understand that when we say sudden, we mean sudden as it relates to the geologic time scale. We're still talking over the period of many, many, many years, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. At this time, we start to see fossils of animals that look more like some of the animals we see today. A few animal phyla appear even earlier than this period, such as different types of sponges and mollusks and some of the creatures that are still around, but there was a large jump in the variety of creatures during this Cambrian period. The Cambrian explosion provides the first evidence of some unique things that we haven't seen before, such as predator-prey interactions. For the first time, we see creatures that have body parts that are meant to attack, and kill other creatures. And then we also see body parts for the first time that are meant as protection against these predators, defense. You see claws and shells and things that you didn't necessarily see before. Here's a great link if you want to find out more about the Cambrian explosion right here at the PBS site. You can click on that and go to that. Your textbook shows you a good illustration showing you a sample of selected animal groups, and so you see where some of these creatures that we still have around today, they actually began quite some time back before what we call the Cambrian explosion. But in the Cambrian period, which was in the Paleozoic, you suddenly have the appearance of a wider variety of creatures, and a lot of them are still around today. Now again, when we say sudden, we mean in a geologic time scale. This is still over the course of millions of years. DNA analysis suggests that a lot of the animals that we see in the Cambrian, they actually began to appear, they diverged from the other creatures prior to the Cambrian explosion, perhaps as early as 700 million or even perhaps in some cases a billion years prior. And there are fossils in different parts of the world, including China, that provide evidence that modern animal phyla, some of the modern creatures we see still today, began tens of millions of years before the Cambrian explosion. So basically what we're saying is we call it a Cambrian explosion, but you might suggest that it's the Cambrian explosion had a very long fuse. Many of these creatures that some say didn't appear at all or suddenly appeared all at once, not really the case. Some of them had descendants or prior historical components that occurred before the Cambrian. And then yes, we did have a jump in the variety of creatures, and there's a variety of reasons for that as well. But when you hear this term Cambrian explosion, make sure that you understand that this rapid speciation was not quite as rapid as many people like to think it was. It's pretty amazing to me that we have fossil evidence of things that you would never think you could have fossil evidence of. So here are some Proterozoic fossils that may be animal embryos. There's certainly small groups of cells here, and so this looks to be like very early animal embryos, like a 2-cell stage or a 8 or 16 cell stage embryo. And it's just amazing to me how good scientists are at teasing information out of rocks, out of the fossil record, including perhaps even looking at embryos of animals from millions of years ago. It's pretty mind-blowing. So the last stage we're going to look at before we take a break is the colonization of land. All of this time, I want to remind you, all of this time that we're talking about, life was only in the water, only in the oceans. Finally, we start to have creatures that come onto the land, and then we again have another explosion of a variety of creatures. You have a new environment, you have what we're going to call a radiation of species, which we'll discuss later. But we have the colonization of land that occurs about this point right here, about 500 million years ago, so half a billion years ago. Fungi, plants, animals began to come onto the land, colonize the land about this time period. Although fossil evidence shows that there were some cyanobacteria and other simple prokaryotes that were on the land to some degree. I mean, they coated the wet rocks and they were up on the wet parts of the soil well before that time period. But to actually live up on the land and permanently stay on the land, that started to begin about 500 million years ago. And there had to be a lot of modifications. The creatures had to adapt and change to this new environment, a much drier environment. So, for example, plants develop vascular tissues that help them transport the liquids and the saps inside of them internally to avoid desiccation and to avoid drying out. And that appears about 420 million years ago. And the plants and fungi today form mutually beneficial associations, and they likely colonize land together. So when plants and fungi came onto the land, that kind of occurred at the same time, and we still find an association between plants and fungi today, especially when you look at the roots of plants. To leave the water and come onto the land, like I said, it required a lot of changes. So like in plants, you have like the vascular tissue and you have waxy leaf coatings. These were all various adaptations that were required for plants to move on to the land. And like I mentioned, we have evidence today where the fungi and the plants, they kind of came onto the land together in about the same time period. And there's a lot of cooperative relationships between plants and fungi, particularly relating to the roots and soil fungus and plant roots, and we still see that today. So there are a variety of fungus groups that live on our bodies and in plants and on other animals. Fungus is an interesting whole entire group of living creatures, and the various relationships that the fungus and the fungi have with other creatures is pretty interesting. Alright, so let's see what else we have. How about we move on to some of the creatures that we might see today, like arthropods. Arthropods would be everything from lobsters to insects, including insects and spiders. And then tetrapods. A tetrapod would be everything else that we consider, land-based animals, from amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. They are the most widespread and diverse of the land animals. Tetrapods evolved from what's called lobed finned fishes. You may have seen some of these lobed finned fishes, varieties of them, are around even today. They are mud skippers and other types of fish that almost look like they have little arms and legs, and they can crawl across the land, and in some cases they can breathe air directly. They can move from one pond to another if their pond starts to dry out. These lobed finned fishes actually were the first creatures to start coming onto the land, and later developed into what we would now call the tetrapods about 365 million years ago. And of course humans are tetrapods as well, although we arrived very late on the scene. So we've been talking about billions of years of change and evolution over time, and humans were not part of that story up until this point. The human lineage, or basically the species that eventually became what we now call modern humans, they began to diverge from the other primates about 6 or 7 million years ago. And then our species, Homo sapiens, the species that you would call all humans today, originated only about 195,000 years ago. So again, 195,000 years ago is the blink of an eye when you compare that to over 4 billion years. If the clock of Earth's history were rescaled to be 1 hour, if the entire history of Earth were 1 hour long, that means humans appeared only about 0.2 seconds ago. 2/10 of a second. So we haven't been around for very long. We'll leave you with this concept, with this illustration here that shows basically the entire history of Earth, 4.6 billion years in 1 hour, in a 1 hour time scale here. So if you were to go around the clock one time representing 1 hour, this kind of shows you some of the things that we have talked about, and you can see for long stretches of time there is not a lot of what we would call modern life. Then you have some of the first insects and reptiles, and all the way up to the first mammals, or way up here at 57 minutes, the ice ages, the most recent ice ages at 59:59, and the first modern humans at 59 minutes, 59.9 seconds. So about 0.1 or 0.2 seconds of this 1 hour would represent our time on the planet as a species. So pretty interesting to look at. We're going to continue on with concept 25.4, which talks about the rise and fall of some of the major groups of animals and living creatures over time. So we'll take a break. We'll come right back in just a moment.